This idea of knight f1, knight g3 again helps attack the bishop on h5, but not something that white chose to do. So a4, not in itself a bad move. Here Kyle plays rook g8, and you can see what's going to happen. Knight c4, so white's still continuing with his plan of attacking the e5 pawn. g5. Here Cole's sort of gone, maybe there's something happening on the d file, which is why he chose the h rook rather than g rook, and that seems perfectly logical. And here white plays what seems like a logical move, g4, and really is in the position. It's the best way to stop the attack. Obviously, if black just calmly plays bishop g6, then white can go about just strong pointing this g4 square. Maybe playing something like knight h2, followed by king g2 and f3, and just sort of sit on the g4 square. The knight can remaneuver, say back to f1 and g3 to f5, and it's in a perfectly fine position. You can then go back to working on the e5 weakness, and any kind of attack down the h file is going to take a long while, and in that time the rook can just swing across to the h file and basically nullify it altogether. So moving the bishop back to g6 isn't really an option, although it probably is the best move in this position. But particularly seeing as Cole's playing a higher rated opponent here, who really outrates him by several hundred points, there's nothing wrong with going, look, I might as well go for an attack. He really has nothing to lose. He's expected to lose based on the rating difference, so might as well. Kyle comments here that he tries to halt my pawn storm in its tracks, and it's the right move, but now I've got a very intriguing option which I take. My knight on f6 was a problem for me, something that we'd mentioned before, that maybe it really belonged on e7 and then going to g6 to try and hop into f4. I wanted to get it out of the way so I could play the move f5, but I couldn't find a good way to do it and leave the knight in a useful spot. So if I've got a bad knight, why not give it up for two very useful pawns? Definitely some logic in what he's saying there. And again, it's often much easier to attack than it is to defend, and we'll see in this game that it's very easy for white to go wrong trying to defend this position. So he takes the knight that's offered, and Kyle comments here that Crafty evaluates the position as plus 0.37 now, which I think shows that there's a lot more going on than him merely being up a knight for two pawns. Put my opponent in a defensive posture, which is always trickier than playing with the initiative, though if anyone at the tournament can handle it, he could, being, I believe, the top seed in the tournament. I really believe that this is my best chance to earn a result, maybe force a perpetual draw or something, but at least it'll be a fun way to lose if he beat me. Which, apart from being a really good attitude, this idea that if you're going to play a game, you might as well play for a win, also has some logic to it as well, that, you know, it's the pressure's on the guy trying to defend, which is often easier said than done. A lot of things have changed recently with, you know, the developments in computers, but defensive play really hasn't. It's still fairly difficult. A lot of the moves that are the correct move that, you know, you'll find out from, you know, analysing a game afterwards by putting in a computer, often aren't so easy to find, particularly over the board. Here white played knight e3, which is a move that he didn't actually like. I don't mind this move so much myself. It's perfectly logical in the sense that it attacks the bishop on g4, helps getting the knight back over to defend. The alternative that also seemed to be pretty good here for white was just to play king g2. Again, the idea that knight e3 can be a follow-up at some stage. So we've still got the pressure on the e5 pawn, so black needs to do something about that. So say black plays along f6. Knight comes back to e3 to threaten the bishop. Let's say bishop e6. This time threatening rook h1. So just sorry, not rook h1, bishop h3. So just rook h1 to stop it. Let's say black plays a move like h5, then you can simply swap off. Queen takes and then king f1. And white's actually better in this position, simply because there's really nowhere for black to attack. Black's got the queen to attack, a few pawns that can march forward, but they don't really do much when they do. But the fact that there's no open files for the rook really changes the balance in white's favour. The bishop is still sort of really hemmed in by its pawns. The only really useful square for it might be c5 or somewhere on the g1 a7 diagonal. But the knight's really a much better piece in this kind of block position. The bishop can easily come around and be a useful piece, whether it's coming back to, maybe coming back to c1 and then e3, or maybe going out to a3 to try and swap it off. But as long as these files are kept closed, there's not a lot. It's not very easy for black to find a winning attack here. Obviously, you've still got squares that the knight in particular would love to get to, so there's obviously ideas, say a manoeuvre like knight d2 to c4 to e3 and then to f5, or some other way that you can get to this f5 square, maybe via g3. So you might even go via g1, so like g1, e2, g3, f5. They're all possible ways of getting to sort of the promised square of the promised land of f5. And once the knight gets there, again, it's going to definitely turn the tables in favour of white. So although on the surface this position looks scary, the fact that the rooks really don't have any obvious way to attack turns the position in white's favour. If, for example, you were able to just take the h-pawn off the board and black could play something like a rook h8 and try and get some pressure down the h-file, then maybe black has something to show for this kind of attack. But without the easy way to get the rooks into the game, I think white's much better in this position. Having said that, let's return to the game after knight e3. Bishop h3. Kyle comments here that his opponent said he'd really like to have knight e3 back if he was going to take any move back afterwards. He said he played it too quickly because he underestimated the threats he was facing. King g2 slows the white attack down a bit, as we saw, and I think it would have eventually petered out. Bishop h3 clears the way for the g-pawn, restricts the white's king, and begins building a mating net, and does it all with tempo when white decides to move his rook out of the line of fire. Yes, all those comments are definitely very valid, although here I'd actually be inclined to give back the exchange. The move that I'd prefer, rather than rook e1 as was played in the game, I'd actually be inclined to play knight d2 here in this position for a number of reasons, and it's also a move that Fritz 11, which I've been using for analysis, prefers. It keeps things very closed on the king side, and white's looking to basically, the more block the position white can make, the better it's going to be, because again, as we mentioned before, those rooks that black has really need somewhere, an open file to attack down. So the plan here is, again, if white takes the rook, there's a couple of options. You can either take it with the knight and then say play like knight g3 and knight f5, and again, because they're on white squares, this f5 square, it's not going to be able to be challenged very easily at all. Also, because this pawn on e5 is still weak, black might actually have to play a move like f5, in which case once the knight gets, black might play f6, in which case once the knight gets to f5 with the white squared bishop off the board, it really can't be attacked at all by anything. Those issues that we mentioned before about rooks not having open files are also going to be great. So even if, so let's say we have a line like g4, which is something that Kyle was considering as an idea. Yes, this continues this pawn roller idea, but the problem is that this bishop now is kind of tied, well, not necessarily tied down, but it's only got one thing it can do, which is take the rook. So here you might play something like knight c4, bishop takes, and then just king takes. And so you've got a move like queen e6, knight f5, and this is where you can see that the white knights really dominate the position. The other knight's going to come back to e3. You've got threats on g4. The king can actually happily sit on e2 if need be, and the white heavy pieces can swing around to the h and g files and sort of slowly mop up these pawns, or at least stop any kind of attack. Alternatively, if black doesn't do something like that, white's got moves like queen h5, which is not only really useful because it attacks the bishop, but again it helps sort of block these pawns and keep this blockaded. Again, the knight's still coming to f5, so there's a lot of defensive resources that white has in this position. Having said that, rook e1 was played. In itself, not such a bad move. g4 is a kind of logical follow-up. Knight d2, and we've got a position fairly similar to the lines we're looking at. And here, black plays g3. Cole makes a comment here that the knight is forced away too, and black gets two free tempos or tempi for his attack in the last few moves. Didn't it see any reason to not use that tempo to just keep shoving my pawn down the board? But after g3, white has a very interesting defensive resource. Queen h5 puts the queen in a better position to parry some of these threats, and puts black in a much tougher situation. Instead, he tries to let my own pawn become the shield to my attack by making it an unsupported passer, blockaded by his king. This is a mistake that swings the game somewhat decisively in black's favour. So as Kyle said, queen h5, it looks visually very risky because you're allowing this g takes f2 check with sort of the rook on the g file. The problem is that there's really no way in for the black rook. It's not really an issue because you have this knight on e3 that is so useful and helps control all these white squares. It covers g2, it covers g4, it can cover f5 if need be. So even after, let's say, pawn takes on f2, king takes f2, there's no way for the rook in. Again, you've got to do something about the queen takes bishop with check threat. And if you play something like queen f6 check, white can simply move the other knight in to help defend. And I think white's perfectly fine holding this position. The knight on e3 covers all the key squares, and if black has to play a move like bishop back to e6, then white's got time to swing the rooks around to the g file and swap off the rooks, and white's more than happy there with the extra piece.